Welcome to Believing the Real, a series of talks on the theology of the real. In this episode, chapter 2 in the series, we will begin looking at evolution from a new perspective, the perspective of Evotrust, a theology of the real, and we will discuss the evolution of predators, procreators, and parents, and what the implications of this trend in evolution may be. Hello, this is the second talk in a series of talks on believing the real, a look at reality and an examination of the trend or the thrust of reality, which exposes something that in fact seems to go against what we know about reality. It's like there are contradictions built in to what we know about reality today, and these contradictions in fact call upon us, or rather they are a challenge for us to develop a theory that would explain the contradictions within reality itself. And in fact, what we are suggesting is the idea of Evotrust, trust in evolution, because evolution is in fact that aspect of the divine that creates the world because it is the self-perfecting aspect of the infinite perfection that is God. So instead of saying, in God we trust, we should say, in God we trust. And how is that God manifested? Through evolution, through the world, through our life, through the cosmos. So that's the idea encapsulated in the idea of Evotrust. So in fact, what we are looking now is a theory of reality, a paradigm of reality, a theological paradigm actually, that attempts to explain the inherent contradictions within reality itself. Now, what does it mean that there are inherent contradictions? It means that the way we look at the world, the theories that we currently have to explain the world are insufficient to cover the entire knowledge of what actually is, to cover our entire vista of empirical knowledge. This is not the first time that we have a problem with our vision of reality. It is always we are looking through a very narrow hole, key through our empirical sciences at what underlies reality, and we keep generating theories that try to explain it. A famous breaking point came just with such a contradiction in the shift from the Newtonian point of view to the Einsteinian point of view. The whole world was believing in Newton, and to this day, Newton's equations are applicable in most everyday situations. And yet there was one point where a contradiction appeared, that Newton's equations were unable to explain the behavior of light, because light in a different way from all other, in contradistinction to all other things in reality, behaves in a very special way. It constantly moves at 300,000 kilometers per second. This is a constant. One of the 8 mysterious constants of the cosmos is the speed of light. And this deviates or goes against the equations of Newton in regard to motion. It disrupts the equations of motion. So everyone rejected this and thought that maybe our instruments were not accurate enough. But slowly, over the 19th century, as our instruments became more and more accurate, it became clear that this knowledge we have about light is accurate, even though it contradicts our knowledge of the Newtonian world, the way Newton described it. So how was this quandary solved? How was this contradiction solved? Ultimately, it was Einstein's decision to say, okay, forget Newton, let's accept the fact of light first. Let's take this one constant. The one constant in our world is light. And it turned out that this very constancy, once you accepted it, made everything else relative. And that became the theory of relativity. But actually it's the theory of constancy of light, and everything else is relative. So we see an example of contradictions within reality that were solved by Einstein's equation. Of course, what we are endeavoring here is not a scientific enterprise in the sense that Einstein conceived it, although it may be, because just like Einstein, we are here trying to conceive of a theoretical framework to explain reality. And but the problem is, I cannot at the moment think of any experiment to confirm this. While for Einstein, there were clear experiments, the famous Eddington experiment in the island of Principe in 1919, which confirmed Einstein's theory. So I have not yet derived any equations or theoretical predictions from this theory of Evotrust, but I can and hope to indeed to point to certain trends within reality that are explained through this vision of the progress and perfection paradigm of the divine. And also, I think this theological perspective settles a number of very interesting contradictions within reality itself. Also, we are approaching this whole concept from a point of view that is open to reality. It is not that we have a dogma and now we are going to force this onto reality. Although, as we mentioned in the previous talk, this happens all the time. Newtonian dogma was dogma, and only reality could refute it. So, in fact, what we are saying now is, look, there are things in reality that underlie, that undermine the theories of science on the one hand, in particular theories of neo-Darwinists about the randomness of evolution, while at the same time, reality also undermines certain perspectives that have become embedded within religions, certain dogmas that would construe reality in a very different way than what we actually know today. So in fact, dogmas can be reasoned at both sides of the divide. Science demands that we have a reductionist point of view that excludes any theological explanations to the cosmos. And in this, science becomes very limited in that, like Mark Twain used to say, if someone has a hammer, then everywhere he looks, he sees nail heads. So in a way, because science would like to do away with theological explanations for historical reasons and some reasons that we will discuss in future videos, then it tends to, from the outside, reject any attempt to provide a theological explanation of reality. On the other hand, and this we can understand why science is so loath to accept religious interpretations of reality, we find religious dogmas that attempt to force their vision onto reality and thereby reject the findings of science. So if we take indeed evolution as a core bone of contention between science and religion, religion mostly attempts to do away with evolution, to refute it, to say it's a wrong theory, to go back to scripture and to say, look, all those dinosaurs you found in the soil, that's just they were deposited in the flood or something, and attempts to ignore actually the findings of science, actually the theories of science, and also the findings of science that are most logically or rationally explained through evolutionary theory. And of course, evolutionary theory has its holes, and these holes and loopholes have been used by creationists to say, to reject evolution out of hand. So actually, we are going to walk here a very narrow path between accepting evolution as the finding of humanity through hundreds of years of doing science, of observing reality, and in particular in our generation, where all of Darwin's observations, which were based on the morphology of creatures and on the geological record, have been confirmed through our knowledge of genetics. You can go into the NCBI website and you can see all those genomes of so many creatures, and all of them are interconnected. They're all very similar, and you can see the percentage of similarity. You can actually reconstruct Darwin's tree of progress of evolution through the genetic perspective, so that we now have the inside view of what Darwin summarized from the outside. Now, this is too strong an evidence of how the world works to be rejected out of hand because of previous dogma. And it behooves us, rather than force our previous dogmas on reality, to re-examine reality and see how we can find a better dogma, a better vision of the divine, a better theology that would indeed be a theology of the real, a theology that takes into account the way that the world has now opened up to the forces of humanity and allowed us to see its inner workings and to discover things that were incomprehensible and unknowable before. So, in fact, in this regard, we are trying to sort of walk this narrow path where we accept evolutionary theory to a certain extent, point to some of its contradictions, and we look at reality to see if it can be explained by our main paradigm, i.e., that the progress of the world, the progression of the world, is its inherent characteristic, because the very reason for the creation of the world is its progress, because this is the aspect of the divine that is becoming more perfect, that is progressing, that is in infinite motion of becoming more complex, more sophisticated, more gentle, more ethically advanced, and so on. And we will, of course, show the various facts on which to which we attach this vision. And so now we are going to look at, in fact, evolution and try to see if the underlying thrust of biological and cosmic evolution does indeed fit this paradigm of progress and perfection. So, of course, from the very outset, it is clear that the Evotrust paradigm is well suited to some of the most mysterious aspects of the cosmos, i.e. The constants that are inexplicable. There's a constant, we don't know why, the seeming randomness of evolution and cosmic evolution. I say seeming randomness because all of our equations point to randomness. And also evolutionary theory at the bottom line talks about randomness. But we actually see a thrust, a certain progress that is obviously not random, is obviously quite methodical in its trend, in its progression. And here you see that I put this picture of to sort of image this. So I put the turtle as like a more a less advanced state, although turtles are quite advanced creatures. And at the top, I put the angel Gabriel with his trumpet to symbolize divinity. But of course, this is these symbols are just markers, but they don't really correspond in any way to the main idea of what we are saying about the theology of the real, i.e., that it is an infinite progression from the furthest, for the most simplest and furthest point from progression, i.e. the compressed world at a point of infinite energy that we now know as the Big Bang, or the theory of the Big Bang, while at the other end of this scale or this progression, we have infinite perfection, and the world is becoming infinitely more perfect because it is the perfecting aspect of the divine. And according to the Kabbalistic paradigm that we are using, the descriptions of the Kabbalah regarding the infinite making room within itself for the creation of the world is exactly apt for this description of a world that begins in infinite smallness in the Big Bang and continually progresses from within itself to some perfection that we do not know, that is somewhere in the very, very distant future. In fact, we can say not the distant future, but an infinite future, because according to our paradigm, there can be no endpoint to the world. And this, in fact, undermines many eschatological visions because we are talking about infinite perfection. So it's also infinite perfectibility. There is no end time. There is no the end of days. It's all going to go on and on and on, so on. So this image I put here is misleading. It's just a symbol of the general idea, but it is misleading about the actual paradigm. So we have to now look at reality and see how its inner qualities, those that seem to contradict themselves, in fact, also point to our Evotrust paradigm. So let's look at first of all, at life itself. Life itself, in general, is something that is inexplicable and quite contrary to what we know about the workings of entropy. Because if the world began with a Big Bang and it's expanding and cooling all the time, then it has a direction, and this is shown by clear thermodynamic equations. Its tendency is to become colder, less animate, and slowly the energy level is going down until ultimately everything will have stopped. All the suns will have burned themselves out, and the world will become a dark place without motion, as it were. But along with this idea of a downward slide into entropy, of decreasing complexity, decreasing energy, in fact, we have the contrast of life itself. And there is no explanation whatsoever for the fact that life appeared and for the fact that it is such a complex thing. And in all that we do not have an explanation for life, except, of course, the theological explanation, which says that all life is part of a divinity. It's this divine spark that is pushing reality because reality itself is that aspect of the divine that progresses all the time. And from what we know from physics today about the actual nature of reality as a quantum reality that is mostly statistical, then we can easily map this onto our theological vision as God manifesting it, her, himself. In fact, all these descriptions become irrelevant because we're talking about infinite perfection and infinite perfectibility, both aspects of God. So the world itself is that aspect of God that is called upon to continue to grow and become more and more perfect. But what is this perfection? What is the vision of this perfection? Can we find some indication of this perfection that the world is striving for, or growing towards, or progressing towards, without adopting some external received dogma? Can we find this, some indications of this in evolution itself, in the development of the world itself? So, first of all, let's look at the world, in fact, and we have the inexplicably strange appearance of the world itself above its randomality. Because since we know that everything is random, then why should the world be as it is? Why should it have these constants? Why should it have the appearance that it has? And how is it that we have a tangible world to live in and that we instinctively live within it, and instinctively we have choices? We make choices all the time. We have free will to do this or that. Every single action that we take, everything we do is a matter of choice. And even if we are living a very routine life based on the customary or on things that we have learned before, it is something that we learned. It is also choice. We choose to behave in this way and that way. And we need a concrete world to be able to do all these things. So in fact, though we know scientifically that underlying all this concreteness are tremendous energies, and that in fact there is nothing tangible in reality, and that is the scientific vision of reality, yet we live in a very clear world that allows, in fact, choice, allows will to come into effect. And this is a central aspect of reality that science does not include it in its equations, but does include in its portrayal of reality. So we have, in fact, unexplained stability and unexplained progress here. Because, in fact, what happens in the world is both contrary to its random nature and to its entropic nature, and yet we see that it moves forward, reminding us again of Galileo's famous dictum, and yet it moves. So now let us take a look at evolution itself and see what kind of trend, what kind of progress we can extract from evolution, regardless of theories about the mechanism of evolution, or rather substituting the mechanistic reductionistic theory of evolution provided by Darwin and by the neo-Darwinists which falls short of explaining reality, because statisticians have showed that there is not enough time and not enough cosmos for randomness to give rise to what we know today about the evolution of life. So, so it falls short. But also religious explanations or religious dogmas also fall short, because they have a static view of reality and also created reality ex nihilo. God created the world and God are distinct and separate, and the whole idea that the world is part of the divine is perceived as a pantheistic idea and as a form of heresy, in fact, in many religions, especially the Abrahamic ones. In any case, obviously our vision is compatible with the Kabbalah, and what's more important, because not with all Kabbalah, with the Rav Kook's Kabbalah, but what's more important, it cannot be compatible with reality, because our test of faith here is not to break our vision of reality because of some dogma and say that no, what we see is not true, God is testing us or something, but rather we turn to reality here and we want to learn from reality. And within reality, we find a certain development that is inexplicable, both from a dogmatic religious point of view and from a dogmatic reductionist point of view. So let's go and take a look at what we know of evolution today and see how we can perceive it through our paradigm, our Evotrust paradigm, that places the real, that places the world at the center of our faith, of our belief. And in fact, it takes this vision of science that says ultimately we can affect the world, and the world reveals itself to us, not some higher source, not some divine revelation, but the world itself is divine revelation. And this revelation is revealed to us through the usual filters of human understanding, which is always limited, but always developing. So nothing is static in this vision. So in fact, this undermines both the idea of design, creationism as the divine designer, and the refutation of the divine designer, because God is not a watchmaker nor an architect, but God himself, itself, herself, God, the divine is in the world. The world is that aspect of the divine that is becoming more perfect. So it's not some external creation and externally created world, but actually we are part of it. We are part of the big developing aspect of God, the progress of God from within. So in fact, this sort of sidesteps the classic argument between evolutionists and creationists, and saying that both of them are wrong, and providing a different perspective on what we know of evolution. So what actually do we know? We know that the world has been evolving for a long time now. Not long enough, according to neo-Darwinists, because statisticians have calculated that for Dawkins' vision of the blind watchman, which requires many mutations that ultimately lead to the world as we know it, in fact, there is not enough time and not enough world, because it would require like something like, I think like 10 to the 300th power years to be able to say that statistically this would occur, while in fact the world only exists something like 10 to the 16th or 10 to the 9th. How much is 14 billion years? It's like 14 with 9 zeros, so it's 10 to the 9th. So it's really a completely different scale. So in fact, evolution is impossible from a random point of view. And so that's one aspect. The other aspect is that there is evolution. Science does describe the way that the cosmos has evolved over the last 14 billion years, beginning from the Big Bang, and we have generation after generation of suns. The world has begun with a very, very simple form of one atom, one electron, and actually has been developing since. The heavier elements have been coming into formation over this hugely long period. And we have the first generation of suns, the second generation, the third. I'm not sure if our sun is the fourth generation or the fifth generation, but on the way, newer elements are being formed, heavier elements, all the heavy elements after iron, I think after 40 on the scale, or 42, I don't remember exactly, have been formed inside supernovas. In fact, a lot of the heavier elements in our own bodies were once within ancient suns that had blown up. So it's really a very mystic. Science itself gives us a very mystic view of how the world has developed. And in particular, when we reach our own sun and our own planet. So indeed, our own sun and our own planet came into being something like 5 billion years ago, the sun 5 billion years ago, and planet Earth is considered to have come into being like 4.2 billion years ago. When I say come into being, I mean coalesce from the ancient materials that are moving in the cosmos since the Big Bang, and they coalesce and then they blow up and they coalesce again. Ultimately, we get to our sun and our planet Earth, and it is, from our perspective, quite late in the evolution of the cosmos. So indeed, it is from a very, very small origins that all this has been occurring, and on a very grand scale, as the galaxies are so, the cosmos is so huge compared to our perspective. It is really something inconceivably enormous. And this is another way in which reality echoes our theological paradigm of infinity, because when we look at the cosmos, we have a sort of parable for our theoretical infinity. We see that it is really so enormous, so infinite, although it is not, it is finite. But it is a worthy a manifestation of the infinite, that this is the finite world that is developing and progressing towards infinity. So within all this hugeness, we have our Earth, and our Earth is part of the slow decline of energy in the cosmos and the cooling of the cosmos towards the ultimate eventual entropy. And during that cooling, in fact, the first time gave rise to conditions where life can develop. As you know, we live on a very thin crust that separates the burning magma, the burning core of the Earth, and the coldness of space. It's just like, I think, 20 kilometers of crust, and we have atmosphere like another 10 kilometers or 20, I don't remember. So it's like something like 40 kilometers is our sphere of life on this ball of fire, in fact. So we are actually living on an encrusted sun, on the plasma inside the Earth, which occasionally erupts, and then we get earthquakes, and we get volcanoes and so on. So on this thin crust, after 2 billion years of existence, for the first time, there appears life. But what is life? In what way is it distinct, and why should it be? Because in fact, it's the same molecules that have been developing and becoming more and more complex. Heavier and heavier elements are coming into being throughout the history of the cosmos. Suddenly, for the first time, they now coalesce around a carbon backbone and become creatures. Although creature is again, it's imbued with theology because it's created, the creator and his creatures. But life, these animated molecules do have, in fact, they are also not external creations of a creator, but internally created from within the world. It is a new appearance within the world, a new form of organization. And the first molecules that consistently become a single entity, an entity wrapped with a membrane that distinguishes it from all other molecules in the world, that it has a self-identity, a self-definition, a definition between inside and outside. This, for the first time, appears on Earth with the Prokaryotes, like 2 billion years ago, more or less. It's the general dating that is agreed upon currently by researchers. So this is the first appearance of, in fact, a distinction, a preservation. And this is the first glimmering of life. In what way is this progress? Why should it even occur? Why would molecules find it more comfortable, do they have volition even, than to just be molecules in the wild? Why suddenly all these elements that have been evolving inside suns suddenly evolve a new form, which we call life? This is inexplicable. We don't understand it, but we know it happened, and we know that everything within these new formations that are able to replicate themselves from one generation to another are all the same elements that went before. They are all molecules that were there before and continue to exist in the world. So this is the beginning. This is the beginning of life, is the prokaryotes, self-replicating molecular structures. Let us call it that. That's, I think, the most reductionistic way of putting it possible. And then this went on for like 1 billion years. And 1 billion years of prokaryotes, just these organisms living within the reality of the earth at the time. And slowly they were transforming the environment. They were making earth, in fact, habitable for the life that would come later on. These microorganisms were changing the atmosphere over a very, very long time, so that ultimately it became oxygenated and capable of sustaining much faster metabolisms. And then the next stage, after this first stage of an organism versus the world, as it were, an organism alone in the world, we have the new stage, the next stage, eukaryotes, still single-celled organisms, but now they have a membrane within a membrane. They have the external membrane, and the inner membrane has a capsule in it which has the genetic code for encoding the future generations of this creature. And at this stage, something new begins to appear, and that is predation. Because now, and this already began with the prokaryotes, in fact, but at some stage, the single cellular organisms start eating each other. So being a predator is the first interaction on Earth between forms of life. One form eats the other. This predation has become a kind of parable for nature, red in tooth and claw, the famous Darwinian maxim of survival of the fittest. Actually, it's not the Darwinian maxim. I think it's a Spencerian maxim. And actually, we will see later on that Evotrust refutes this vision, because we will see that it is not survival of the fittest, but actually more in the direction of survival of the sweetest. And I'm saying this jokingly now, but I will show you in future talks how much this is a more apt description of reality than survival of the fittest. Although fitness is there, but what kind of fitness? Is it a fitness of power, of strength, of destroying, or is the fitness of something much more gentle? But obviously, the first progression of reality, the first progression of life beyond the first prokaryotes that were just imbibing elements from their environment and incorporating external molecules within their inner molecular structure, is the incorporation of entire other creatures which have it already arranged. Why bother to seek all the elements that we need, that the creature needs for living, when it can just eat another creature that has already organized it, break down its elements, and have it made? So the first interaction between forms of life is predation. But let's be clear about this. This is just the beginning. It's the first form, and it's still with us. We still eat. We still predation. One life form eating the other is still the main way that we get our nourishment, of course. And obviously, the only ones who use a different method are the plants, which, though they are higher life form, still take energy from the sun, and they take the elements from the ground, and they make the conversion and create it into their flesh. And in fact, I'm sorry, it's bad news for vegetarians, but plants are life forms, and when we eat them, we eat a life form that has worked very hard to build up its own body by incorporating other molecules. But that's beside the point, because indeed we will see that there is difference between plant life and animal life, and essentially we will get into the morality of all this later on, and it will be then obvious that vegetarianism is a more moral standpoint than a morally commendable and also evolutionarily compatible, evotrustingly compatible development from the point of view of ethical progress of reality. But this we will get to in future talks. In any case, the important point at this moment, at this juncture, is that predation is the first interaction of life. But life did not remain there, because when eukaryotes appear, and in fact, they create the basis for what will then appear on top of them, the multicellular organism. About 600 million years ago, the eukaryotes, the single cellular creatures which had a core, now learn to live together. So, in fact, the self-recognition became the basis of creating an entire creature in which many cellular organisms live together in a colony, each recognizing the other. But not only that, the new development was that they not only recognized each other, but they now had a division of labor, so that some single cells were in charge of, say, motility. Whole systems sprang up, like motility, nerves, muscles, the ability to perceive, all these things that we take for granted in life, in creatures, actually were all innovations, were all evolutionary innovations that were completely how should I say, unforeseen. We of course they were unforeseen. We only see them in retrospect, but they could not have been predicted from what we knew about the world before they appeared. Why should the molecules, they are all made of the same stuff. I'm reminding you, it's the same stuff. It's atoms and electrons. That's the old vision. But never mind, all those, let's call it the basic units or the basic particles that quantum theory, quantum physics know how to describe. They are all made of this. The world is made of the same stuff. But now we have a multicellular organism. And we now not only have a multicellular organism, where all the old eukaryotes are now carrying on in a very different way, giving room to each other and specializing. And until this day, they are still single cellular organisms. Every cell in your body is capable of actually the same functions as a single cell organism. And when we have cancer, this is why cancer is so rampant, because there's so many kinds of it, because what cancer means is that they revert to the wild. All kinds of mechanisms that control the behavior of each single cell so that it works in harmony with the rest, including suicide every 3 months or so and replacement by new ones. These mechanisms break down, and the cells start fending for themselves. They go back an evolutionary stage, as it were, to the single cell existence. So actually, our bodies are the next step, and this next step incorporates the previous step. The previous step, everything is still just molecules. It's still just the same stuff that all of the cosmos is made of. So we see here the unity of the cosmos as well, lurking behind the scenes of what we know about reality today. But what else is new? What else is new is that now there begins once multicellular creatures appear, we see a split, that the single creature begins to have two different forms. Sometimes there's more, like in bees and ants, you have the queen, the drones, and the males, and so you have female, male, and drone, and species where you have up to 5 different genders. But most of the living world has 2 genders, male and female. And these 2 genders, these 2 genera of the same creature, the same multicellular creature, have different ways of coping with the world. One copes with it in one way and the other in another way. But the important thing is, sometimes they cope sometimes they cope in very similar ways, sometimes very diverse ways. But in actual fact, it's the same creature. And the only thing that changes is the gender. And then a new thing appears, where before the only concept of another creature was, can I eat it or not? Is it me or not? Now it's, can I eat it or can I mate with it? Because maybe the other creature is like me. It's someone with whom I will merge to create the next generation. So now, in fact, this is the invention of sex, the original invention of sex, of sexual procreation, of sexual reproduction. This is also an innovation. So we see how the innovation becomes more and more complex, and also more and more has recognition in it of self and other, and the other, where before it was just let's eat it, now it's let's mate with it, because this other is actually another form very similar to me. This other form, if you are a male, then the female form is the closest to you. And if you are a female, the male form is the closest to you. And genetically, we know that all our genes are identical, both with the male and the female, and there's just one chromosome out of all the chromosomes that we have that bears the gene that the genes that determine if we will be male or female. So if we talk about chromosomes, it all depends on what you got from your male ancestor, from your father. If your father gave you, you always get an X from your mother, because the mother has XX. So when the sex cells are split within our bodies and are transferred to the next generation, you get a complement of 23 chromosomes from the father and 23 from the mother. 22 of those 23 from each parent are identical, and they merge, and you get like 44 chromosomes, one from each parent, and then the last two you get one from the mother and one from the father. Now the mother has two X's, so you can only get an X from the mother, but the father has the X, just like the mother, and it has a Y. If you get the X from your father, you will have XX, you will be a woman. If you get a Y from your father, you will have XY, you will be a man. But you are exactly the same creature. And if you knew the randomness of the shuffle during procreation, this is the amazing thing. Each person now on Earth who is biologically a male or a female originally could have been either this or that, because it's exactly the same creature with just these added traits that make it into gender specific. So all these ideas, and we will get into it in greater depth in future talks, of equating biology with destiny, of making genders an essentialist criterion for segregating humans, or for relegating one human being to one status and the other type of human being to another status. Essentially, when we look at evolution, we see that this is just something very external, because internally we are built the same. We have everything is the same. Most of our genetic makeup is the same, and only the difference is this difference that we either get from the father or the mother, which determines our gender. We will have a lot more to say about this in future, but the important thing is that this same creature now has two variations, and they learn to find each other. So sexuality enters the world, and a new type of other comes into the world. This new other seeks the other to join with, to procreate with, to merge material with, so to merge bodily fluids with. So in fact, this is another level. Before, you were seeking someone who is not yourself to devour and incorporate that other's substance into your own substance, which is what we do when we eat. But now a new level appears through evolution, the appearance of sexuality, where you find the other in order to share genetic material with, in order to combine your genetic material with, to merge yourself with another. If you will, we could say this is the invention of love. But there's this old joke about the fisherman loving fish. So there is an element of love in devouring the other as well. So what kind of love is that? Obviously, the love of the devourer and the love of is not the same as the love of the procreator. And we will get more into this in future when we try to take out the implications of all these innovations. But what is important to see is that we have a trend here. It's a different kind of way of looking at the other, where before it was just the function of devouring the other. Now it's a different function. It's approaching the other in order to team up, to hook up, to become one. So if we were looking at it from an ethical point of view, it's like they always have this slogan from the 60s, make love, not war, where the war is when you devour the other, where the love is where you merge with the other to create new life. So this is a new aspect of progress in evolution that has no explanation. We don't understand why it happened. In fact, evolutionists are saying, why, this is so wasteful. What's wrong with the old style of the old unicellular approach of just splitting yourself? Why do we have this newfangled thing that so much energy is spent on mating? And they have explanations because of genetic drift, genetic so on, they have theories. But our theory, this theory of this theology, a theological theory, which talks about progress, I think maps very well onto the way that evolution is actually behaving. So, what's the next step? The next step, if we look at these life forms that began to appear, then we have fish, and we have amphibians on the verge between marine life and land life. And this is about the time that plants begin to appear on land. The flowering plants is a very recent innovation. This is we shouldn't forget plant life. These are also creatures who are multicellular, or they have a different approach, and they have become the basis of all other life. But what's the next stage? So we get reptiles. And then we get like a reptile, some kind of ancient reptile, sometime like 300 million years ago or 260 million years ago, it's not really clear, that splits off for the first time into mammals and fowls, the birds. In fact, the birds, if you look at Wikipedia, the birds are considered to be dinosaurs, to be the new or the current manifestation of what were dinosaurs in the past. So when we're talking about extinction of dinosaurs, not all dinosaurs became extinct. Some of them learned to fly, and the world of birds, and some of them are modern day reptiles, of course. So, but also we have the world of the mammals. In fact, these two branches in evolution represent the new innovation in evolutionary progress, because they bring something new to the world from the point of view of how we treat the other. Because before we have predation, and then we had procreation, now we get to parenting. So this is the new thing. We not only eat, we not only procreate, but we parent. We invest time and effort. We become unselfish creatures. And I bring this is the parable of this idea of unselfishness. The number of flights that a common sparrow makes in order to feed its chicks in the nest. I read somewhere it was like 5,000, but even if it's much less, like hundreds of flights looking for food and bringing it in its mouth to its chick and feeding it and raising it, devotion to the next generation. And we see two separate strategies here. We see the mammalian strategy, where the offspring is protected within the womb of the mother, and the mother becomes focused on the offspring, and the entire, and also society becomes more established. You get a society of mammals, you get the males protecting the herd, you get the females protecting the young, and it's all about a new way of treating the other as someone you invest in, someone you have maternal or paternal love for, not just the love of the hunter who wants to eat, not just the love of the mater who wants to procreate, but now parental love, the love of a mother or father who invest so much of their own bodies and energies to fostering the next generation. Now we see here two distinct strategies. One is the mammalian strategy, protects the other, the young other within the body of the mother. And when it's born, it stands on its feet within a few hours and becomes part of the herd. And then the herd, the social herd, protects it. And the strategy of the birds, the fowl, a chick who is completely helpless, born, breaks out of the egg external to the body of the mother, and the mother and the father, both of them or either one of them, makes hundreds of flights and brings food until the chick, who is protected in the nest, grows enough to start flying itself. So it's a much longer process. And on the outside, you'll notice that the next point of progress in humans combines both strategies. Humans are the only living creatures on Earth that are both mammals. The child, the embryo is reared within the womb of the mother throughout gestation, and then when it is born, it doesn't stand on its own 2 feet like a fowl or a foal, like a foal or a calf or other mammals that immediately become self-sufficient and capable of motion, but rather lies there even more helpless than the most helpless of chicks, and waits for the mother to take care of it. And of course, society has developed much more. We will go into this in much greater depth when we discuss mammals in general and humans as mammals and the way we developed within the evolution of mammals. But the main point here, the thrust that we want to make here, and what we have seen up until now, this is again evident that the ethical turn towards the other receives a new dimension now, because now we have a turn to the other that cares for it, that loves it, that just gives it and wants its well-being for its own sake rather than for anything that we want. And this is what we want. It is a drive. It is biological. It is something that develops directly out of the biological. And in this, we also find a way that we're saying, look, all these ideas of instincts, of drives, it's not clear here, because you see that evolution is preparing the way for more and more volition, more and more a behavior that is more and more open to decisions, because finding your prey, finding your mate, and caring for your child are different endeavors. They are like one on top of the other, and the final endeavor, that of parenting, brings forth a new kind of love, a new kind of facing or orientation towards the other. And in the next our next talk, we will go into greater depth how this appears within the mammalian world and the human world, and the appearance of social evolution, or of the appearance of sociability within the mammalian societies. greater groups each have a division of labor, and this reminds us of the original appearance, if you will, of the multicellular organisms. Now we have societies with multi-individuals, many individuals, and each one of them assuming a different role. Again, everything blends one into the other, but we obviously see here progress from the point of view of the ethics that begins to appear here, the care of another being. And if you will, if we go back to our theological perspective, then the God in the world, the God that manifests, sorry, not the God, you see all those old theological terms, it's so difficult to find the right theological terms to describe this new concept. But let's say that aspect of God that is becoming more perfect is now achieving a perfection that is echoing the ultimate perfection that we talk of when we talk about the perfection of God. We talk about his ultimate goodness, his grace, his compassion, his love for the world. And now we see that from the world itself, from evolution itself, love appears, compassion appears, the care of the other appears, so that the evolving world, that divine aspect of God that is the world, has begun to manifest that aspect of perfection in infinity, the perfection of goodness, of compassion, of caring for the other. And this appears for the first time in the evolution of parenting. So you see, like from molecules, we find suddenly life, and life starts treating other life, and organisms find other organisms, and we go from predation to procreation to parenting, and we will see in the next talk the further stages, and you will see that it's all in this progression, and we will have a lot of ethical lessons to learn from this progress. And it will teach us a lot, both about reality and feed into our meta theory of Evotrust, the belief in the real. Because all we talked about is the real, is evolution. So